The wagon wheels creaked to a halt as Nora Parker stared in dismay at the swollen river before her, the normally placid waters now a raging torrent that blocked her path to a new life. The spring rains of 1873 had transformed the gentle crossing into a churning monster, and Nora could feel her heart sink as she realized her journey west might end here, stranded in the middle of nowhere with two hungry children and dwindling supplies. "Mama, are we going to cross?" 7-year-old Thomas asked, his small hand tugging at her worn calico skirt as he peered at the angry waters from beneath the wagon's canvas cover. "Not today, sweetheart," Nora replied, forcing a smile she didn't feel. At 26, she had already endured more than most the loss of her husband to typhoid fever back in Missouri, the sale of their small farm to pay debts, and now this desperate journey to Oregon where her cousin had promised work and a fresh start. The river's too high. "We'll make camp and wait for it to go down." 5-year-old Emma's face appeared beside her brother's, blonde curls framing worried blue eyes that reminded Nora so much of John, her late husband. "I'm scared, Mama. It sounds angry." Nora helped her children down from the wagon, her muscles aching from weeks on the trail. "The river's just full of water from the rain, that's all. We'll be fine right here." She spoke with a confidence she didn't possess as she unhitched her 2 oxen and set about making a modest camp on a small rise near the riverbank. The afternoon passed slowly as Nora gathered what firewood she could find in the sparse landscape. Their situation was precarious. They had separated from the wagon train 3 days ago when Emma had developed a fever, forcing them to stop while the others continued. The delay meant they now traveled alone, a dangerous proposition in these untamed territories. As dusk approached, the skies darkened ominously, and Nora felt the first fat raindrops hit her face. She hurried to secure the wagon cover and move their meager belongings inside, just as the heavens opened. Rain pounded the canvas roof as thunder rolled across the plains. "We should have stayed with the others," she whispered to herself, regret washing over her as fiercely as the rain outside. But Emma's fever had broken, and Nora had been certain they could catch up to the wagon train before the next major river crossing. Now, as lightning illuminated the turbulent waters that had already risen several more inches since they'd arrived, she feared she had made a terrible mistake. Morning brought no relief. The rain had continued through the night, and Nora awoke to the terrifying sound of rushing water much closer than it had been the previous evening. She scrambled outside to discover the river had risen dramatically, its banks overflowing and water now lapping at the wheels of her wagon. "Thomas." "Emma, wake up," she called, panic rising in her throat. "We need to move to higher ground." She struggled to hitch the oxen as water swirled around her ankles. The animals sensed danger and bellowed nervously, fighting against her efforts to secure them to the wagon. By the time she had them in place, the water had risen to her knees. "Mama," Emma cried from the wagon, clutching her rag doll to her chest. "Stay inside," Nora commanded, climbing up to the driver's seat, her sodden skirts weighing her down. She snapped the reins, urging the oxen forward and away from the encroaching flood. The animals strained against the weight of the wagon, now fighting both gravity and the pull of the water. They had moved perhaps 20 yards when Nora heard an ominous crack. The right rear wheel, already weakened from the long journey, had struck a submerged rock. The wagon lurched sickeningly, and she felt it begin to tilt. "Hold on," she screamed to her children as the wagon settled at a dangerous angle. Water began seeping through the floorboards as the broken wheel collapsed entirely. Nora leaped down into the knee-deep water and fought her way to the back of the wagon. "Come to me," she called, reaching up for Emma first. The little girl sobbed as Nora lifted her into her arms, then placed her on a small rise of land that remained above the floodwaters. "Stay right here. Don't move," she instructed, then returned for Thomas, who had already gathered their small food sack and his sister's doll. "I saved Molly for Emma," he said solemnly, trying to be brave despite the fear in his eyes. "Good boy," Nora praised, helping him down and leading him to where Emma waited. She turned back to the wagon, mentally cataloging what she must save: the family Bible, John's pocket watch, the small box containing her wedding ring, and the locket with her parents' portraits. Everything else could be replaced, but not these treasures that connected them to the past. As she waded back to the wagon, a sudden surge of water hit with enough force to knock her sideways. She regained her footing only to watch in horror as the current caught the wagon and began to pull it toward the main channel of the river. "No," she cried, lunging for the tailgate. Her fingers brushed the wood but couldn't find purchase. The oxen, still hitched, bellowed in terror as they were dragged along, unable to break free. Within moments, the current had taken her wagon, their home, and most of their possessions. Nora stood stunned, water now at her thighs, watching as everything she owned disappeared downstream. The oxen finally broke free of their harnesses and managed to swim to the opposite bank, but the wagon overturned completely and vanished beneath the muddy waters. Shock gave way to the immediate need to protect her children. Nora splashed back to where Thomas and Emma huddled together on their small island of dry land, which was shrinking by the minute as the waters continued to rise. "We need to get to higher ground," she said, forcing calm into her voice. She pointed to a ridge perhaps a quarter-mile away. "We're going to walk there together." "But the water's too deep, Mama," Emma whimpered. "I'll carry you," Nora promised, though she wasn't sure how she would manage both children through the increasingly dangerous floodwaters. She hoisted Emma onto her hip and took Thomas's hand. "Stay close to me," she instructed her son. "If the water gets too deep, I'll come back for you after I get Emma to safety." They had taken only a few steps when Thomas slipped, going momentarily under the surface before Nora could grab his collar and pull him up, sputtering and frightened. "I can't do this," Nora thought desperately, realizing she couldn't safely transport both children through the deepening water. Their small refuge was disappearing rapidly beneath the rising flood. Soon they would have nowhere to stand at all. That's when she heard a shout carried on the wind, barely audible above the roar of the water. Nora turned toward the sound and saw a rider approaching from the west, pushing his horse hard across the higher ground that ran parallel to the river. "Help!" she screamed, waving her free arm frantically. "Please help us!" The rider changed course immediately, guiding his horse toward them. As he drew closer, Nora could make out a tall man on a powerful chestnut stallion. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the rain and a slicker that flapped in the wind as he rode. The horse splashed into the shallower edges of the flood, its rider guiding it expertly toward their precarious island. When he was perhaps 20 yards away, the man dismounted and led his horse through the water toward them. "Madam," he called, his voice deep and steady. "You folks are in a bad spot." Relief nearly buckled Nora's knees. "Our wagon broke," she explained, gesturing helplessly downstream. "We're stranded." The stranger reached them, and Nora saw his face clearly for the first time. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps early 30s, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the open sky. Dark hair peeked out from beneath his hat, and his eyes were a startling blue that reminded her of the clear Montana skies she'd seen weeks ago on their journey. "Name's Xavier Garrison," he said, tipping his hat slightly despite the dire circumstances. "Looks like you could use some assistance." "Nora Parker," she replied. "These are my children, Thomas and Emma." The children stared up at the tall stranger, Thomas with curiosity, Emma with lingering fear. "Pleased to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances." Xavier surveyed their situation with a practiced eye. "That water's rising fast. We need to get you folks to higher ground right quick." As if to emphasize his point, a fresh surge of water washed over their small refuge, now barely the size of a dining table. "I can take the little one first," Xavier said, holding out his arms to Emma. The child shrank back against her mother. "It's all right, sweetheart," Nora assured her. "This kind man is going to help us." Emma reluctantly allowed Xavier to lift her. He settled her securely in front of him on his horse, then turned back to Nora and Thomas. "I'll be back for you both in minutes," he promised. "Stay as high as you can. If the water rises more before I return, start moving toward that ridge there." He pointed to the same high ground Nora had spotted earlier. Nora nodded, holding Thomas close as Xavier guided his horse through the floodwaters, one hand steadying Emma, the other on the reins. The horse moved confidently despite the challenging conditions, and Nora watched anxiously until they reached the relative safety of the ridge. True to his word, Xavier returned quickly, this time taking Thomas. The boy went more willingly than his sister had, fascinated by the powerful horse and its rider. When Xavier returned the third time, the water had risen to Nora's waist, and their island had all but disappeared. She was shivering, partly from cold and partly from fear, but determined not to show it. "Your turn, Mrs. Parker," Xavier said, extending his hand. "Nora, please," she replied, taking his offered hand and feeling the strength in his grip as he helped her onto the horse behind him. "Hold tight," he instructed, and Nora hesitantly placed her hands on his waist. As the horse began to move through the deepening water, she was forced to tighten her grip, acutely aware of the solid warmth of him against the chill that had seeped into her bones. When they reached the ridge where her children waited, Nora slid from the horse, her legs nearly buckling beneath her as the adrenaline that had kept her going began to fade. "Thank you," she said simply, though the words seemed wholly inadequate for what this stranger had done. Xavier dismounted and removed his slicker, draping it around her shoulders despite her protest. "You're soaked through, madam. Need to get you warmed up." He surveyed the surrounding landscape, then pointed to a stand of trees perhaps a mile distant. "I've got a camp set up over there." "Not much, but it's dry and I've got coffee and food." Nora hesitated only briefly. They had no supplies, no shelter, and the rain continued to fall. Her children were wet, hungry, and frightened. Pride had no place in survival. "We would be most grateful," she said. Xavier lifted Emma onto his horse, then Thomas, before helping Nora up behind them. He took the reins and began leading them toward the trees, walking steadily despite the muddy ground and continuing rain. "Were you traveling alone?" he asked as they walked. "We were with a wagon train, but my daughter fell ill. We stopped to let her recover while the others continued. We were trying to catch up when the rains came." Nora tried to keep the despair from her voice as she added, "Everything we owned was in that wagon." Xavier glanced back at her, his expression sympathetic but not pitying. "Things can be replaced, Mrs. Parker. You and your children are safe. That's what matters." His simple words somehow eased the crushing weight of their loss, at least momentarily. Nora tightened her arms around her children, drawing comfort from their solid presence against her. "Are you a rancher?" Thomas asked, curiosity getting the better of his shyness. Xavier smiled slightly. "Of a sort. I've got a small place about 15 miles east of here. Raise some cattle, break horses for the larger outfits. Do you live all alone?" the boy continued, earning a gentle reprimand from his mother. "Thomas, don't pry," but Xavier didn't seem to mind. "Just me and my dog, Scout. He's guarding the camp right now, but don't worry, he's friendly enough once he knows you're welcome." They reached the trees to find a simple but well-established camp beneath the protective canopy. A large canvas tarp had been stretched between several trees, creating a dry space beneath. A small fire smoldered under its own shelter of branches, and beside it lay a large brown and white dog who rose immediately at their approach, hackles raised until Xavier spoke. "Easy, Scout. These folks are friends." The dog relaxed slightly but maintained a watchful stance as Xavier helped Nora and the children down from his horse. "Let's get that fire built up," he said, quickly adding wood until flames leaped high enough to provide both light and warmth. He rummaged in his saddlebags and pulled out a coffee pot and some supplies. "Got some coffee and jerky, not much of a feast, but it's something." "It's more than we have," Nora said softly. "We're in your debt, Mr. Garrison." "Xavier," he corrected, setting the coffee to boil. "And there's no debt. Anyone would do the same." But Nora knew that wasn't true. In the 2 years since John's death, she had learned that kindness from strangers was rare and often came with expectations she wasn't willing to meet. Xavier moved efficiently around the camp, pulling extra blankets from his bedroll and handing them to Nora. "You and the children should change out of those wet clothes. I'll turn my back." Nora helped Emma and Thomas remove their sodden garments, wrapping them in the blankets before quickly changing herself, grateful for Xavier's respectful distance. The blankets smelled of horse and leather and wood smoke, not unpleasant, but distinctly masculine scents that reminded her how long it had been since she'd relied on a man's strength. "All decent," she called softly when they were done. Xavier returned to the fire, pouring coffee into a tin cup for her and offering jerky to the children, who accepted it eagerly. He had removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at his neck. Up close, Nora could see that his eyes weren't simply blue but flecked with gray, like the sky before a storm. "Where were you headed?" he asked, settling across from them with his own cup of coffee. "Oregon," Nora replied. "My cousin lives near Portland. She wrote that they need teachers, and I taught school before I married." Xavier nodded thoughtfully. "Long journey." "Longer now," Nora said, unable to keep the defeat from her voice, "without our wagon and supplies." She trailed off, the enormity of their loss hitting her anew. "We'll figure something out," Xavier said simply, as if their problem were now his as well. "First light, I'll ride back to the crossing, see if anything washed up downstream." Hope flickered in Nora's chest, though she tried to temper it. "That's very kind, but I couldn't ask. You didn't ask," he interrupted gently. "I offered." Emma, who had been quietly watching the exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Are you a real cowboy?" Xavier's serious expression softened. "I suppose I am, little lady. My papa was a farmer," she said. "But he's in heaven now." An uncomfortable silence followed her innocent declaration, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the continuing patter of rain on the tarp above. "I'm sorry for your loss," Xavier said finally, looking at Nora with genuine sympathy in his eyes. "Thank you," she replied. "It's been 2 years now." Xavier nodded but didn't press for more information, a courtesy Nora appreciated. Instead, he turned his attention to Thomas, who had been eyeing Scout with increasing interest. "Would you like to meet him properly?" Xavier asked, gesturing to the dog. Thomas nodded eagerly. "Scout, come," Xavier commanded, and the dog padded over obediently. "Hold your hand out, palm down, so he can smell you." Thomas did as instructed, and after a cautious sniff, Scout allowed the boy to pet his head. Soon Emma joined her brother, and the dog endured their attention with surprising patience. "He's used to being on his own with me," Xavier explained to Nora. "Not much company out here most days." "How long have you been in these parts?" she asked. "Going on 5 years now," he replied. "Came west after the war, worked cattle drives up from Texas for a spell, then saved enough to buy my own place." He paused, then added, "It's not much, but it's mine." There was a quiet pride in his voice that resonated with Nora. Before John's death, they'd had that same sense of accomplishment in their small Missouri farm. She missed that feeling of belonging, of having roots somewhere. As darkness fell completely, the children began to droop with exhaustion. Xavier helped Nora arrange a bed for them with his spare blankets under the tarp. "You should rest too," he said once Thomas and Emma had settled. "Been a long day." "What about you?" Nora asked, noticing he had given them most of his bedding. "I'll keep watch," he replied, adding wood to the fire. "River's still rising. Best to have someone awake." Nora wanted to protest but found herself overwhelmed by fatigue. She lay down beside her children, pulling Xavier's slicker over them as an extra layer of warmth. Despite her concerns, sleep claimed her almost immediately. She awoke sometime in the night to find the rain had stopped. Moonlight filtered through the trees, casting silver patterns on the ground. Xavier sat by the fire, his profile illuminated by the flames, Scout lying at his feet. He looked toward her as she sat up. "Everything all right?" he asked softly. "Yes," she whispered, careful not to wake the children. "Thank you again. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Xavier shook his head slightly. "No need for thanks. Get some more rest. Morning will be here soon enough." Nora lay back down, but sleep eluded her now. She watched Xavier through half-closed eyes, wondering what circumstances had shaped this quiet, capable man who had so readily come to their aid. There was a gentleness in him that belied his weathered exterior, evident in the way he had handled her frightened children and in the respect he showed her. It had been a long time since she had allowed herself to notice such things about a man. After John died, survival had consumed her, keeping a roof over their heads, food on the table, and eventually making the difficult decision to sell everything and head west for a fresh start. There had been no room for softer emotions in the harsh reality of widowhood. Yet here, in the midst of disaster, she found herself acutely aware of Xavier Garrison and the unexpected sanctuary he provided. It was a dangerous awareness, she knew. They were strangers thrown together by circumstance, nothing more. In a few days, they would part ways, and she would need to focus on rebuilding their lives from nothing. With that sobering thought, Nora finally drifted back to sleep, her dreams a confused jumble of raging waters and steady blue eyes. Morning brought clearer skies and the monumental task of figuring out their next steps. Xavier was already up when Nora awoke, cooking something that smelled wonderfully like real food rather than trail rations. "Found some wild onions and managed to shoot a rabbit," he explained when he noticed her surprised expression. "Not much, but better than jerky for breakfast." The children woke to the enticing aroma, their spirits noticeably improved by dry clothes, still slightly damp but better than the previous day, sunshine, and the prospect of a hot meal. After they had eaten, Xavier saddled his horse. "I'm going to ride down to the river, see what might have washed up from your wagon. You folks stay here where it's safe." "I should come with you," Nora protested. "I know what to look for." Xavier considered this, then nodded. "The children?" "I'm 7, Thomas declared proudly. "I can watch Emma." Nora hesitated, torn between wanting to search for their possessions and not wanting to leave her children alone. "Scout will stay with them," Xavier offered, seeming to understand her dilemma. "He's better protection than most men I know." After extracting solemn promises from Thomas and Emma to stay in the camp and obey Scout, which earned a small smile from Xavier, Nora allowed him to help her onto his horse. She settled behind him, once again aware of his solid presence as she held onto his waist. They rode in silence toward the river, which had receded somewhat overnight but still ran high and fast. Xavier guided his horse along the bank, heading downstream where debris from the flood had collected. "There." Nora pointed suddenly, spotting a familiar shape caught in some branches at the water's edge. It was one of their trunks, somehow still intact despite its journey downstream. Xavier dismounted and carefully made his way to the trunk, testing each step on the muddy bank. He wrestled it free from the branches and carried it to higher ground before helping Nora down from the horse. With trembling fingers, Nora opened the trunk to find their clothes soaked but present. Beneath them lay the family Bible, its pages waterlogged but still legible, and wrapped in one of John's shirts, her small box of treasures. "Oh, thank God," she breathed, opening the box to find her wedding ring and the locket still safe inside. "Important?" Xavier asked, watching her cradle the box. "Memories," Nora replied simply, "some of the few we have left of their father." They continued their search, finding scattered pieces of the wagon but little else of value. One of the oxen had drowned, its body caught on a fallen tree, but there was no sign of the other. "Probably made it to safety," Xavier reassured her, seeing her distress. "They're strong animals." By midday, they had salvaged what they could: the trunk of clothes, a dented cooking pot, and a canvas bag containing some of their food supplies that had somehow remained sealed against the water. It wasn't much, but it was more than Nora had dared hope for. As Xavier loaded their recovered items onto his horse, Nora faced the brutal reality of their situation. They had some clothes and a few possessions, but no transportation, no shelter, and very limited supplies. The nearest town was over 20 miles away, and they were still hundreds of miles from Oregon. "What will you do now?" Xavier asked as they prepared to return to camp. Nora stared at the rushing river that had so thoroughly derailed their lives. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice small. "We can't continue to Oregon, not without a wagon, but we can't stay here either." Xavier was quiet for a moment, seemingly weighing something in his mind. "My ranch isn't far," he said finally. "It's not much, but there's a cabin, clean water, and food. You and your children could stay there while you figure things out." The offer stunned Nora. That's too generous. We couldn't impose, it's not an imposition, Xavier interrupted. Place gets lonely sometimes. Besides, winter's coming. You don't want to be stuck in town with no money and two young ones to feed. He had a point, though Nora was wary of accepting such charity from a virtual stranger. Yet what choice did she have? Their funds were limited, meant to sustain them until she could find work in Oregon. Using that money for temporary lodging would leave them destitute within weeks. I can pay you something, she offered. For room and board, Xavier shook his head. No need, but if you're set on contributing, I could use help around the place. Can't afford to hire help, and there's always more work than hours in the day. The arrangement seemed fair, and Nora felt some of her reservations ease. This would be a business arrangement of sorts, not pure charity. All right, she agreed, but only until I can make other arrangements for us. Xavier nodded, though something flickered in his eyes' disappointment. Relief. Nora couldn't be sure. He helped her onto his horse, and they rode back to camp where Thomas and Emma greeted them eagerly, proud of having obeyed all instructions in their absence. They spent one more night at the camp before setting out for Xavier's ranch the following morning. The journey took most of the day, with Xavier walking alongside the horse that carried Nora and the children, their salvaged possessions tied behind the saddle. As they crested a small rise in the late afternoon, Xavier pointed ahead. There it is, home. Nora followed his gaze to see a modest cabin nestled in a valley with a small barn and corral beside it. A creek ran nearby, and in the pastures beyond, she could make out the shapes of cattle grazing. It was simple but well-maintained, with smoke rising from the chimney. But who's there, she asked, confused, if you've been with us? Xavier smiled slightly. Mrs. Holbrook from the next property over. She comes by once a week to do some cleaning and leave a stew or such. Good woman. Husband died in the war, and she manages on her own with her grown son. They made their way down to the cabin, and Scout raced ahead, barking excitedly at their approach. As they drew closer, an older woman appeared at the door, wiping her hands on her apron. Xavier Garrison, she called. Was starting to wonder if you'd fallen off a cliff somewhere. Not quite, Mrs. Holbrook, Xavier replied as they reached the yard. Got caught up helping these folks when the river flooded. Mrs. Holbrook's sharp eyes took in Nora and the children, curiosity evident in her expression. Well now, who do we have here? Xavier handled the introductions, explaining briefly about the flood and the loss of their wagon. He finished by saying they'll be staying here a while until they can get back on their feet. If Mrs. Holbrook had any opinions about this arrangement, she kept them to herself, merely nodding and saying, well, you've certainly picked a good place to land. Xavier here is the most decent man in 3 counties. She turned to Nora with a warm smile. Come in, dear. You look like you could use a hot meal and a proper rest. The cabin's interior was surprisingly comfortable. A large main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a solid table, a few chairs, and a stone fireplace where a kettle bubbled. 2 doors led off this main room, one to Xavier's bedroom, Nora presumed, and another to what appeared to be a small storeroom. You folks can have my room, Xavier said, gesturing to the bedroom. I'll bunk out here by the fire. We couldn't possibly, Nora began, but he cut her off gently. I insist. Been sleeping under the stars half my life anyway. A roof's just a luxury. Mrs. Holbrook chuckled. Stubborn as they come, this one. Best just agree, Mrs. Parker, or we'll be arguing till Christmas. Too exhausted to protest further, Nora allowed Mrs. Holbrook to show her and the children to the bedroom, which contained a neatly made bed covered with a handmade quilt, a small chest of drawers, and a washstand with a basin and pitcher. It's not fancy, Mrs. Holbrook said, but it's clean and warm. It's perfect, Nora replied sincerely. After their ordeal and nights sleeping on the ground, the simple room looked like a palace. Mrs. Holbrook left them to settle in, returning to the kitchen where delicious smells were emanating from the pot on the fire. Nora helped the children change into dry clothes from their salvaged trunk, before joining Xavier and Mrs. Holbrook for a supper of rabbit stew and cornbread. The meal was simple but hearty, and for the first time in days, Nora felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. The children, too, seemed more relaxed, especially Thomas, who had immediately taken to Xavier and followed him around asking questions about ranch life. After supper, Mrs. Holbrook took her leave, promising to return in a few days with some extra supplies. "Got some outgrown clothes from my grandchildren that might fit these little ones," she said, "and I'll bring some preserves from my cellar. Growing children need fruit, even in winter." Once she had gone, Xavier showed Nora where everything was kept in the cabin, the pantry with its stored goods, the water barrel, the woodpile outside. "Make yourselves at home," he said. "What's mine is yours while you're here." That first night, Nora lay awake in Xavier's bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the occasional lowing of cattle, the soft whinny of his horse in the barn, the rustle of wind through the trees outside. It felt strange to be under a solid roof again after weeks in the wagon, stranger still to be in the bed of a man she barely knew while he slept by the fire in the next room. Yet, there was an undeniable comfort in their surroundings. For the first time since leaving Missouri, Nora felt they were in a place where they could catch their breath, where the constant pressure of the journey and then the disaster had eased. She drifted off to sleep with the scent of wood smoke and clean linen around her, and for once her dreams were peaceful. The days quickly fell into a routine. Xavier rose before dawn to tend the cattle and horses, often with Thomas trailing eagerly behind him. Nora took over the cooking and cleaning, grateful to have a way to repay his kindness. Emma helped as she could, collecting eggs from the few chickens Xavier kept and feeding Scout, with whom she had formed a fast friendship. A week passed, then two. October arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color in the trees. Nora knew they should be making plans to move on, but she found herself reluctant to broach the subject. The children were thriving in the stability of ranch life, and she herself had begun to feel a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced since before John's death. Xavier, too, seemed to have adjusted to their presence. His initial reserve had gradually softened, and Nora often caught him smiling at the children's antics or engaging Thomas in serious discussions about ranch operations. In the evenings, he sometimes read aloud from one of the few books he owned, his deep voice bringing the stories to life for Emma and Thomas before they went to bed. It was during one such evening, with the children finally asleep and the cabin quiet save for the crackling of the fire, that Xavier finally asked the question Nora had been dreading. "Have you given thought to your plans? Winter will be setting in soon. Travel gets difficult once the snow flies." Nora set aside the shirt of his she had been mending and met his gaze across the firelit room. "I have," she admitted, "but I'm not sure what's best anymore." Xavier waited, giving her space to continue. "Oregon seems impossible now," she said slowly, "without a wagon with winter coming. And the children are settled here, happier than I've seen them in a long time." "They're resilient," Xavier observed. "Kids adapt quick." "Yes, but—" Nora hesitated, then decided honesty was the only fair approach. "We've imposed on your generosity long enough. I should find work in town, perhaps rooms we could rent until spring." Xavier was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "You're welcome to stay, Nora, the winter, the spring, longer if you want." The suggestion hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken implications. Nora felt her heart beat faster, uncertain how to respond. In the weeks they had lived under his roof, she had grown increasingly aware of Xavier not just as their rescuer and host, but as a man, his quiet strength, his gentle way with her children, the intelligence behind his sometimes taciturn exterior. "That's very generous," she said finally, "but I can't expect you to support us indefinitely." "What if it wasn't about generosity?" Xavier asked, meeting her eyes directly now. "What if I've grown used to having you all here? The cabin feels more like a home with you in it." Nora's breath caught at the simple honesty of his words. "Xavier, I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," he added quickly. "Just saying there's a place for you here, all of you, for as long as you want it." The offer touched something deep within Nora, a longing for stability and connection she had denied for too long, but caution tempered her response. "I need to think of the children," she said softly. "I am thinking of them," Xavier replied. "Thomas has taken to ranch life like he was born to it. Emma laughs more every day. They're healing here, same as you are." It was true. The haunted look that had shadowed her children's eyes since their father's death had gradually faded during their time at the ranch. Thomas had blossomed under Xavier's patient guidance, and Emma had regained the carefree spirit of a normal 5-year-old. As for herself, Nora couldn't deny that something had awakened in her, something she had thought died with John. Being around Xavier, watching him with her children, sharing the quiet evenings by the fire, it had stirred feelings she had not expected to experience again. "I don't want your charity," she said finally. "It isn't charity I'm offering, Nora." The intensity in his voice made her look up sharply. Xavier had moved closer, though still maintaining a respectful distance. "What are you offering, then?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Partnership," he replied simply. "This place needs a woman's touch. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I need what you've brought here. Life, family." The implication was clear, though he had carefully avoided any direct mention of deeper feelings. Nora appreciated his restraint, his understanding that such things couldn't be rushed, especially with her children to consider. "I need time," she said finally. "This is all so unexpected." Xavier nodded, accepting her answer without pressing further. "Take all the time you need. Nothing has to change unless you want it to." But things had already changed, Nora realized as she lay awake that night. The comfortable routine they had established now carried an undercurrent of possibility, of a future she had not dared to imagine when they first arrived at Xavier's door. Could she build a new life here, so far from her original destination? Could she allow herself to care for Xavier as more than just the man who had rescued them from the flood? And most importantly, would it be fair to him to enter any arrangement still carrying the weight of her past? These questions followed Nora through the days that followed as autumn deepened around them. Xavier was true to his word, making no demands and showing no impatience for her decision. He continued as before, kind to her children, respectful to her, steadily working to prepare the ranch for winter. It was during these preparations that disaster struck again. Xavier had ridden out early one morning to check on cattle in the far pasture, expecting to return by midday. When evening came with no sign of him, Nora began to worry. "Maybe he's just late, Mama," Thomas suggested as they ate the supper she had kept warm for hours. "I'm sure that's it," Nora agreed, trying to sound confident for the children's sake. But as darkness fell completely and still Xavier didn't appear, her concern grew to genuine fear. She put the children to bed with assurances that Xavier would be there when they woke, then sat by the fire, listening for the sound of hoofbeats that didn't come. Scout grew increasingly restless, pacing by the door and whining softly. "You're worried too, aren't you?" Nora said to the dog, rubbing his ears. "Where is he, Scout?" Just after midnight, when Nora had nearly convinced herself to wait until morning before raising an alarm, she heard a noise outside, not the expected sound of a horse, but a shuffling, dragging sound. Scout barked once and bolted for the door. Nora grabbed the rifle Xavier kept by the door. He had taught her to use it, insisting she know how to protect herself and the children if necessary, and cautiously peered out. In the faint moonlight, she could make out a figure staggering toward the cabin. "Xavier," she called, heart pounding. "Nora," came the weak reply, and she threw open the door to find Xavier barely keeping himself upright, his face pale with pain and one leg dragging uselessly behind him. "My God, what happened?" she gasped, rushing to support him. "Horse spooked at her rattler," he managed through gritted teeth. "Threw me into a ravine. Think my leg's broken." With Scout hovering anxiously nearby, Nora helped Xavier into the cabin and onto the bearskin rug before the fire. His face was etched with pain, and he was shivering with cold and shock. "How did you get back?" she asked as she hurried to build up the fire. "Crawled mostly," Xavier replied, his voice strained. "Then used a branch as a crutch. Took all day." The image of him dragging himself for miles, injured and alone, brought tears to Nora's eyes. She blinked them away, focusing instead on what needed to be done. We need to get you warm, then look at that leg, she said, reaching for blankets. The children, awakened by the commotion, appeared in the bedroom doorway with wide, frightened eyes. Xavier's hurt, Nora explained as calmly as she could. Thomas, I need you to bring water from the barrel. Emma, fetch the clean cloths from the shelf. While the children hurried to obey, Nora carefully removed Xavier's boot and cut away his pant leg to reveal a swollen, misshapen limb that was clearly broken. There was no open wound, but the bruising was extensive. That bad, huh? Xavier asked, noting her expression. It needs to be set, Nora said grimly, and I'm not sure I know how. Mrs. Holbrook's son, Xavier suggested through clenched teeth. Ben, he set bones before. I'll send Thomas at first light, Nora decided. For now, we need to immobilize it and try to bring down the swelling. Working as gently as possible, Nora cleaned the leg and applied cold compresses to reduce the swelling. Xavier endured her ministrations stoically, though she could see the effort it cost him in the tightness around his mouth and the sweat beading on his forehead. The children watched solemnly, Emma clutching her doll to her chest, Thomas trying to appear brave though his lower lip trembled slightly. I'll be fine, Xavier assured them, managing a strained smile. Just a broken bone, had worse falling out of trees as a boy. His attempt at lightness seemed to reassure them somewhat, and Nora sent them back to bed with promises to call if they were needed. Once they were gone, she offered Xavier a drink from the bottle of whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes. Thanks, he said after taking a long swallow. Sorry to cause such trouble. Don't be ridiculous, Nora replied, continuing to apply cold compresses to his leg. You've given us shelter and safety for weeks. The least I can do is patch you up when you need it. A ghost of a smile touched Xavier's lips. Still, not how I plan to spend the evening. How did you plan to spend it? Nora asked, partly to distract him from the pain. Thought I might finally convince you to play checkers with me, he said. Been trying for weeks. Nora smiled despite her worry. Well, you're not going anywhere for a while. You'll have plenty of chances to lose to me at checkers. That confident, are you? Xavier's voice was weaker now, the whiskey and exhaustion taking their toll. Get some rest, Nora said softly. Thomas will fetch Ben at first light. Xavier's eyes were already closing, his body surrendering to the demands of pain and the long journey home. Nora continued to sit beside him, replacing the cold compresses and occasionally wiping his brow when fever threatened. As she watched over him through the long night, Nora realized with sudden clarity what she had perhaps known for weeks but been afraid to acknowledge. She had come to care deeply for this man. The thought of losing him, of what might have happened if he hadn't managed to drag himself home, was unbearable. When morning came, Nora sent Thomas to the Holbrook farm with instructions to bring Ben back as quickly as possible. In the meantime, she did what she could to make Xavier comfortable, though he drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes muttering incoherently when fever gripped him. Ben Holbrook arrived mid-morning, a tall, serious young man who immediately took charge of the situation. Ma's coming along behind with supplies, he explained as he examined Xavier's leg. Gonna have to set this proper, won't be pleasant. What can I do? Nora asked, determined to be useful. Hold him down, Ben replied grimly, and maybe have that whiskey ready for after. The setting of the bone was as brutal as Nora had feared. Xavier, who had been semi-conscious when Ben arrived, came fully awake with a hoarse cry as Ben manipulated the broken bone back into place. Nora held his shoulders, murmuring words of comfort that she wasn't sure he could hear over his own ragged breathing. Mrs. Holbrook arrived just as Ben was finishing, bringing splints and clean bandages. Together, they immobilized Xavier's leg and made him as comfortable as possible on a pallet near the fire. He'll need watching, Mrs. Holbrook told Nora after Xavier had fallen into an exhausted sleep. Fever's the danger now, keep it down if you can. I will, Nora promised. You care for him, Mrs. Holbrook observed, her shrewd eyes missing nothing. Nora didn't bother to deny it. Yes. The older woman nodded approvingly. Good, man's been alone too long. Needs someone to remind him life's for living, not just working. She patted Nora's hand. You call if you need anything. Ben or I will come right away." After the Holbrooks left, Nora settled into a routine of caring for Xavier while also maintaining the daily chores of the ranch. Thomas proved invaluable, taking on responsibilities far beyond his years, feeding the animals and bringing in firewood under Nora's guidance. Emma appointed herself Xavier's special helper, bringing him water and entertaining him with stories when he was awake enough to listen. Her childish chatter seemed to soothe him, and Nora often found him watching the little girl with a tender expression that made her heart constrict. Days passed, with Xavier's condition improving gradually. The fever broke after the second night and color began to return to his face. By the end of the week, he was alert and increasingly frustrated by his confinement. "The cattle need checking," he fretted one evening as Nora changed his bandages. "And the north fence was weakening last time I rode out there." "Ben's been looking after the cattle," Nora assured him. "And Thomas and I checked the fences yesterday. Everything is fine." Xavier shook his head in wonder. "Don't know how you're managing it all." "We're a team," Nora replied simply. "That's what you wanted, isn't it? A partnership." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing steadily despite, or perhaps because of, the challenges they faced. "It is," Xavier confirmed softly. "More than ever." As October gave way to November, Xavier recovered enough to move around the cabin with the aid of crutches Ben had fashioned for him. His forced inactivity led to long conversations with Nora in the evenings after the children were asleep, discussions about books, about their pasts, about their hopes for the future. Nora learned that Xavier had fought for the Union, had lost his parents young and been raised by an uncle who taught him ranching. He had come west seeking a fresh start after the war left him with nightmares and a distaste for crowded places. In turn, she told him about her life with John, the happiness they had shared, and the devastating loss of his death. She spoke of her fears for her children's future, her determination to give them stability and education despite their reduced circumstances. These conversations, honest and unguarded, created a bond between them that grew stronger with each passing day. Nora found herself looking forward to the quiet evenings by the fire, to the sound of Xavier's voice, to the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. It was during one such evening, with the first snow of winter falling softly outside, that Xavier finally spoke the words that had been hovering unspoken between them. "I love you, Nora," he said simply, his blue eyes steady on hers. "You and the children. I know it hasn't been long, and I know you carry John in your heart still, but I wanted you to know." Nora felt tears spring to her eyes, not of sadness, but of a complicated joy. "Xavier, you don't need to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I'm not asking for promises. Just wanted it said, that's all." But Nora needed to speak, needed him to understand what had happened in her heart these past months. "When I lost John, I thought that part of my life was over," she said softly. "I couldn't imagine loving anyone else, couldn't imagine anyone filling that empty space he left." Xavier nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "But that's not how it works, is it?" Nora continued, moving to sit beside him on the bench by the fire. "The heart doesn't just replace one love with another, it grows, makes room." Hope flickered in Xavier's eyes. "And has yours made room?" "Yes," Nora admitted, the single word carrying all the emotion she felt. "I love you too, Xavier. I think perhaps I have for some time now." The smile that transformed his face was like sunrise after a long night. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Xavier leaned forward and kissed her, a gentle, questioning kiss that asked rather than demanded. Nora responded with a certainty that surprised even her hand coming up to rest against his cheek as the kiss deepened into something that spoke of promises and possibilities. When they finally drew apart, Xavier rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "I never expected this," he confessed. "When I found you by that river, I was just doing what needed doing, never thought you'd change my whole life." "You changed ours first," Nora reminded him. "You gave us safety when we had nothing. And you gave me a family when I thought I'd always be alone," Xavier replied. He took her hand, his expression growing serious again. I want to make it official, Nora. If you'll have me, I want to marry you, be a father to Thomas and Emma, build a life together right here. The proposal, though not entirely unexpected after their declarations, still took Nora's breath away. Marriage meant commitment, permanence, a final acknowledgement that their life in Missouri was truly behind them and a new one had begun here in this valley with this man. The children, she said, her practical nature asserting itself even as her heart soared. We should talk to them first, Xavier nodded, understanding as always. Of course, though I think Thomas might have been dropping hints about calling me Pa for weeks now. Nora laughed softly, remembering her son's increasingly obvious attachment to Xavier. And Emma asked me yesterday if you were going to be her new daddy. Smart kids, Xavier said with a grin, figured it out before we did. The next morning, with sunlight streaming through the windows and fresh snow blanketing the world outside, Nora and Xavier sat down with the children to discuss their future. Xavier has asked me to marry him, Nora explained, watching their faces carefully. That would mean we'd stay here permanently. He would be your stepfather. How would you feel about that? Thomas's face lit up immediately. Really, we'd stay here forever. That's the plan, Xavier confirmed. If it's all right with you and your sister. Emma regarded them solemnly for a moment, then asked, Would you be our new papa? Xavier leaned forward, his expression serious. I would never try to replace your real father, Emma. He'll always be your papa, but I would be honored to be a second father to you if you'll let me. Emma considered this, then nodded decisively. That's good, because Scout needs a mama and a papa too. The simple childish logic broke the tension, and they all laughed, even Scout, who thumped his tail at the sound of his name. Just like that, it was settled they would become a family, not by blood but by choice and circumstance and the love that had grown between them. With the children's blessing secured, Xavier and Nora wasted no time in making their union official. The nearest town was still too far for Xavier to travel with his broken leg, so Mrs. Holbrook suggested a solution. Pastor Williams makes rounds to the outlying ranches every few weeks, she explained. Due here in 3 days' time, he could perform the ceremony right here. And so it was arranged. Mrs. Holbrook and her son Ben helped prepare for the simple wedding, bringing extra food and even a small cake that Mrs. Holbrook had baked specially. Emma wore her best dress, carefully preserved from their journey, and Thomas stood tall and proud beside Xavier, who managed to stand without his crutches for the brief ceremony. Nora wore a blue dress Mrs. Holbrook had altered from one of her own, with wildflowers Emma had found still blooming in a sheltered valley arranged in her hair. When she spoke her vows, promising to love and honor Xavier for all her days, she felt a sense of rightness, of coming home after a long journey. Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife as snow fell gently outside the cabin windows, and firelight cast a golden glow over their small gathering. Xavier kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes, and then they were surrounded by the children, forming a tight circle of embraces that symbolized their new family bond. That night, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep, Xavier and Nora stood together at the cabin door, looking out at the moonlit snow that transformed their valley into a silver wonderland. Happy? Xavier asked, his arm around her waist. More than I thought possible, Nora admitted, leaning against him. When the wagon broke in that flood, I thought we had lost everything. I never imagined we were actually finding our way home. Xavier kissed her temple gently. Home isn't a place, Nora, it's people. You and the children, you're my home now, wherever we might be. And you're ours, she replied, turning in his arms to face him. My cowboy who carried us across the river and straight into a new life. As their lips met in a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows, Nora thought of the long journey that had brought them to this moment, the hardships, the loss, the unexpected joy of finding love when she least expected it. Life had taught her that the path forward was never straight or predictable, but standing in the arms of the man who had rescued them in more ways than one. She knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family. Spring came to the valley with a riot of wildflowers and the bleating of new calves in the pastures. Xavier's leg had healed well, though he still walked with a slight limp that the local doctor assured him would eventually fade with time and exercise. The ranch had flourished under their combined care. Nora had planted a vegetable garden beside the cabin, and Xavier had built in addition to the house a proper bedroom for the children, giving him and Nora privacy they had lacked during the winter months. Thomas, now 8, had taken to ranch life with unbridled enthusiasm. He shadowed Xavier throughout his daily chores, learning to ride, to mend fences, to care for the animals with a dedication that made both Nora and Xavier proud. Emma had started her schooling with Nora teaching her letters and numbers each morning. In the afternoons, she often accompanied Xavier and Thomas on shorter rides around the property, perched happily in front of Xavier on his horse, chattering about the flowers she had identified or the birds she had spotted. As for Nora and Xavier, their love had deepened through the winter months of close quarters and shared responsibilities. They had learned each other's rhythms, discovered each other's strengths and weaknesses, and built a partnership that balanced them both. On a warm day in May, with the scent of new growth heavy in the air, Nora sat on the porch of their cabin, mending one of Thomas's shirts that had suffered during his latest adventure exploring the creek. Xavier was due back soon from town where he had gone to purchase supplies and mail letters Nora had written to her cousin in Oregon, explaining her change of plans. The sound of hoofbeats announced his return, and Nora looked up to see Xavier riding toward the cabin, his broad-brimmed hat shading his face from the afternoon sun. Even after months of marriage, the sight of him still caused her heart to quicken. "Mama, Xavier's back." Emma called, running from where she had been playing with Scout in the yard. Thomas appeared from the direction of the barn, wiping his hands on his pants as he hurried to greet his stepfather. The children reached Xavier just as he dismounted, both talking at once, eager to share their day's activities. Nora watched from the porch, a smile playing on her lips as Xavier listened seriously to both children, giving each his full attention despite their overlapping stories. He had taken to fatherhood as naturally as breathing, his patience and gentle guidance exactly what Thomas and Emma had needed after the turmoil of the past years. When he finally made his way to the porch, packages under his arm and children still chattering at his heels, Xavier's eyes sought Nora's with the same warmth that never failed to touch her. "Missed you," he said simply, leaning down to kiss her briefly. "And I you," she replied. "How was town?" "Same as always. Got everything on your list plus a surprise or two." He handed the packages to the children. "Why don't you two take these inside? There might be something in there for you." With excited exclamations, Thomas and Emma disappeared into the cabin, leaving Nora and Xavier alone on the porch. "You look troubled," Nora observed, noting the slight furrow between his brows that appeared when something was bothering him. Xavier sat beside her on the bench, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "Met the new marshal in town. Says there's been trouble with rustlers in the next county. Warned us all to keep a close eye on our herds." Nora felt a flutter of concern. Cattle rustling was a serious matter, often leading to violence. "Do you think they'll come this far?" "Hard to say," Xavier replied. "We're pretty isolated out here, which could make us either a less likely target or an easier one." He took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Don't worry too much. I'll talk to Ben about keeping watch, maybe hire an extra hand for the summer if we can afford it." Nora nodded, pushing aside her worries. They had weathered worse challenges and would face this one as they had the others together. "I have news of my own," she said, changing the subject. Xavier raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Mrs. Williams, the pastor's wife, stopped by while you were gone. She's starting a small school in town for the ranchers' children. Asked if I might be interested in teaching a few days a week come fall." "And are you?" Xavier asked, his expression carefully neutral. Nora hesitated. "I told her I needed to discuss it with you. It would mean being away from the ranch 2 or 3 days a week, staying in town overnight sometimes if the weather's bad." "You miss teaching," Xavier observed. It wasn't a question. "I do," Nora admitted, but my first responsibility is to you and the children, to our home." Xavier's face softened into a smile. "Nora, if you want to teach, you should teach. We can manage here. Thomas is old enough to help more, and Emma could go with you to town, start her formal schooling." "You wouldn't mind?" Nora asked, searching his face for any sign of reluctance. "Mind?" "I'd be proud," Xavier said, squeezing her hand. "You have gifts that shouldn't go unused. Besides," he added with a teasing glint in his eye, "a little absence might make the heart grow fonder." Nora laughed softly. "As if I could be any fonder of you than I already am." Xavier leaned in to kiss her properly this time, a lingering kiss that spoke of the passion that still flared between them despite the familiarity of marriage. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers for a moment before saying, "Tell Mrs. Williams yes, we'll make it work." Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the children bursting back onto the porch, Emma clutching a new doll and Thomas proudly displaying a jackknife Xavier had bought him in town. "Look, Mama," Emma exclaimed, showing off the doll's painted porcelain face. "Isn't she beautiful?" "The most beautiful doll I've ever seen," Nora agreed, pulling her daughter onto her lap. Thomas carefully closed his new knife and tucked it into his pocket. "Xavier says I can use it to help with the leather work," he said importantly, "if I'm careful." "Very careful," Xavier emphasized with mock sternness that didn't quite hide his pride in the boy's growing capabilities. As they sat together on the porch, the afternoon sun warming them and Scout dozing at their feet, Nora was struck by the completeness of her happiness. The future held challenges, rustlers, separations when she began teaching, the ongoing work of the ranch, but it also held promise and purpose and love. She thought back to that terrible day at the flooded river, when all had seemed lost. How strange and wonderful that disaster had led them here, to this man and this home and this life that exceeded any dreams she might have had. Xavier caught her reflective look and raised an eyebrow in question. "Just counting my blessings," Nora explained with a smile. "And finding I need more than my fingers and toes to count them all." Xavier's answering smile was tender as he looked at her and the children, his family, carved not from blood but from choice and love and the shared journey that had brought them together. "I know exactly what you mean," he said softly. "Exactly what you mean."